Hello, welcome to the Tim Booker channel. I wish you a pleasant listening experience. Today, I'll talk about a book by American international political analyst Allison titled Essence of Decision. This 416-page book might seem initially focused on decision-making in management based on its title. However, a glance at the subtitle changes that perspective. The subtitle, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, takes the content in a different direction. In essence, it doesn't offer mere techniques for decision-making but, rather, uses the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 as a vivid case study to explain the general process and challenges of significant decision-making. This approach holds more persuasive power than a mere checklist. Imagine this scenario: you're a fledgling president. 3 weeks from now, your party will participate in midterm elections, and all your attention is focused there. One morning, your national security advisor pays an unexpected visit. He presents a few reconnaissance photographs, expressing concern, informing you that an adversarial nation is constructing missile bases barely 200 kilometers from your coastline. These missiles have a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers and could target your capital within minutes. The Air Force chief suggests an immediate strike on these bases, while the national security advisor advocates doing nothing, disregarding the opponent. Meanwhile, your brother supports intercepting the opponent's missile transport routes by sea. Both your country and your adversary possess the world's top 2 nuclear arsenals. A conflict could endanger hundreds of millions of lives. You're overwhelmed, yet everyone awaits your decision. This scenario isn't a plotline from a murder mystery. It was the real crisis faced by President Kennedy in October 1962. We now know that the Cuban Missile Crisis concluded peacefully. The U.S. government, within a short 13-day period, initiated a blockade of the Cuban coast and, through a series of negotiations with the Soviet Union, compelled them to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. This crisis, fraught with danger, has been the subject of numerous historical works and documentaries. However, to strategic scholars, the most intriguing aspect of the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't the trivial historical details but a core question: how did the Kennedy administration, with insufficient information, make decisions most advantageous to the United States? Kennedy, at that time, didn't have the luxury of hindsight like later historians did, examining numerous declassified documents. His entire knowledge comprised a few blurry photographs and semi-reliable intelligence gathered from embassies and spies. Assessing the Soviet government's intentions accurately based on this information was nearly impossible. Additionally, within the U.S. government, there were divergent opinions from the outset, some advocating invasion, others favoring airstrikes, and yet others proposing a naval blockade. Making choices among these proposals and convincing others posed a monumental challenge for Kennedy. The author of this book, Allison, dissects Kennedy's decision-making process into 3 levels in detail. The first level, the rational actor model, aims to infer the most probable Soviet motives and devise different response strategies. The second level, the organizational behavior model, reconstructs the opponent's most familiar and proficient reaction mechanisms and, based on the characteristics of one's own organization, selects among alternative strategies. The third level, the governmental politics model, discusses how government decision-making appears as a result of high-level collective deliberation. Yet, due to differing procedural flows, each person's professional background, temperament, and varying weights in discussions, internal negotiations become exceedingly chaotic. The ultimate decision might not be the most efficient but is invariably one that most people are willing to accept. Within these 3 levels, there's psychology, organizational behavior, game theory knowledge, and a hint of management skills. This book not only revisits the decision-making process of the Kennedy government in October 1962 but also provides a reference for our daily work and life decisions. Applying the decision-making framework for a nuclear crisis to smaller-scale matters is a significant leap. Hence, Essence of Decision was well received upon its English release in 1971, underwent substantial revision in 1999, and continues to be regarded as a classic in the fields of political science and public administration. The author, Graham Allison, mentored by Kissinger, is also the founding dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Since the 1960s, he served as an advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense and the RAND Corporation, specializing in government decision-making issues. In the 1990s, Allison even served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration, offering a seasoned scholarly perspective combined with practical political experience. His analysis of decision-making problems gains more credibility due to this fusion of personal experiences. Allison also invited Philip Zelikow, a history professor at the University of Virginia and a senior advisor in 3 U.S. administrations, to co-author this book, lending Essence of Decision considerable authority. Next, I'll introduce the main content of this book based on Allison's 3-tiered framework. First, exploring the rational actor model to deduce Soviet motives. Second, analyzing why the U.S. chose a naval blockade from a series of options within the organizational behavior model. And finally, outlining the manifestations of the governmental politics model in high-level U.S. decision-making. Before delving into the content of this book, let me provide some background on the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy took office in 1960, amid a delicate phase of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. The United States had surpassed the Soviet Union in both the quantity and quality of nuclear missiles. However, the Soviets held advantages in 2 critical strategic areas, Germany and Cuba. In 1961, Soviet leader Khrushchev ordered the construction of the Berlin Wall in East Germany, applying pressure on U.S. military deployments in Europe. Despite the strong stance of the Kennedy administration, their response was delayed, losing some momentum. As for Cuba, since the victory of the 1959 revolution, it had been in a confrontational relationship with the United States. In 1961, the Cuban revolutionary government, led by Castro, repelled an invasion by U.S.-backed exiles. It can be said that throughout 1961, the Soviet Union was on the offensive. The crisis of 1962 was a continuation of this Soviet offensive, U.S. defensive dynamic. Now, let's go back to the White House in October 1962, put ourselves in Kennedy's shoes, and see what information he had at his disposal. On October 16, when Kennedy first saw reconnaissance photographs taken by high-altitude planes over Cuba, the Soviet deployment of missiles in Cuba had been ongoing for several months. These activities had been under surveillance by U.S. aircraft and spies. However, the initial batches of missiles transported by the Soviet Union to Cuba were either surface-to-air missiles for defense or had a range of only 200 to 300 kilometers, not posing a significant threat to the United States, so the American side didn't pay much attention. However, the photos from October 16 revealed that the new batch of missiles transported by the Soviet Union to Cuba was the R-12 type, with a range of nearly 2,000 kilometers, sufficient to reach the U.S. capital with nuclear warheads. Moreover, the Soviet Union had also established bases in Cuba for their latest intermediate-range missile, the R-14, capable of covering the majority of mainland U.S. cities. Kennedy couldn't sit idly by any longer. On the evening of October 16, Kennedy ordered the establishment of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, abbreviated as EXCOM, as the highest decision-making body during the crisis. The EXCOM comprised 12 members, including the President himself, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the CIA Director, and other senior officials. President Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was also part of it. The first task of this committee was to speculate on the Soviet motive behind deploying missiles. In international politics, probing the adversary's motives often marks the first step in decision-making. Understanding the cause and the resources invested by the opponent helps formulate corresponding counter-strategies. In speculating the motive, the Kennedy administration used a thinking model called the rational actor. It suggests that a country's interests, irrespective of its leadership or system, are always clear and limited. To achieve these clear goals, a country devises action plans based on its available resources, striving for maximum benefit at minimum cost. In this model, the state as an actor in international politics is simplified to the familiar concept of a rational actor. It always seeks to maximize utility, pursuing gains and avoiding harm, hence the term rational actor. The question arises, in 1962, how much benefit did the Soviet Union aim to gain by daring to deploy intermediate-range missiles right at America's doorstep? The Executive Committee, using the rational actor model, proposed 4 possibilities. The first is the Cuban defense theory. It suggests that as Cuba stood as the Soviet Union's sole ally in Latin America and was geographically close to the United States, it held significant propaganda value. However, Cuba's defense was unstable after the 1961 attempted invasion planned by the United States. Castro had repeatedly appealed to Khrushchev for Soviet assistance in reinforcing Cuba's defenses. Thus, the initial intention behind the Soviet missile deployment might have been to safeguard Cuba. Yet, this speculation has evident flaws. If the Soviet goal was merely to defend Cuba from invasion, they could have deployed conventional forces or shorter-range missiles, below 150 kilometers, without threatening the U.S. mainland. Such reinforcements would have sufficed for localized conflicts without necessitating missiles like the R-12 that directly threatened the U.S. capital. Moreover, if the U.S. discovered the R-12 deployment, they could have reacted aggressively by bombing Cuba or launching a direct invasion, contrary to defending Cuba. Hence, this theory was disproved. The second is the Cold War politics theory. It suggests that the Soviet Union viewed the Cold War as a global chessboard and sought to test any place that could tarnish the U.S. image. Cuba happened to be a thorn in Kennedy's side due to the 1961 failed invasion, affecting his credibility. If another significant event occurred in Cuba before the midterm elections, Kennedy's prestige would suffer further, benefiting the Soviet Union. While this speculation aligns broadly with the macro picture, it falters in details. Firstly, undermining Kennedy's reputation, just like defending Cuba, didn't necessitate conspicuous intermediate-range missiles. A treaty or a public announcement could have had a similar effect without creating such commotion. Additionally, if the Soviet Union aimed for the midterm elections, they should have expedited the deployment of the most lethal R-14 missiles in Cuba, yet the Soviets seemed leisurely for months on end. Thus, the Cold War politics theory fell short and required supplementary motives. The third is the missile strength theory. It posits that the Soviet Union lagged behind the United States in both the number and range of nuclear weapons. In case of a nuclear war, the U.S. had the upper hand in a decisive first strike. Deploying a batch of missiles in Cuba, even with shorter ranges, could directly threaten the U.S. mainland, neutralizing the Soviet disadvantage in nuclear arsenals. However, this speculation also faces inexplicable aspects. Firstly, most of the Soviet medium-range missiles were developed after 1959 and were unstable in performance. Why rush to deploy these unstable missiles in Cuba in 1962 to counter the nuclear disadvantage? Wasn't it reckless? Additionally, deploying intermediate-range missiles near the U.S. increased conflict levels significantly in the Cold War. Did Khrushchev have the resolve for this? It seems uncertain. Thus, the missile strength theory had its flaws. The fourth is the Berlin issue theory, Kennedy's favored explanation. After the 1961 Berlin Wall incident, tensions persisted between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in Germany. Berlin and the German question affected the attitudes of Western European countries toward the United States, being the most crucial front in the Cold War. Khrushchev corresponded with Kennedy 9 times from September 1961 to September 1962, with 7 letters mentioning Berlin. His forthcoming visit to the U.S. in November 1962 aimed to directly address the Berlin issue. For Kennedy, Berlin was the true focal point of the Cold War, while Cuba was peripheral. Khrushchev aimed to leverage this seemingly dispensable card, Cuba, to negotiate concessions from the U.S. in Berlin. However, Kennedy's speculation failed to explain some anomalies, such as the prolonged Soviet presence in Cuba and the lack of camouflage at their sites despite the frequent surveillance by U.S. reconnaissance planes, secrecy being fundamental military knowledge. By this point, you might have realized that among the 4 speculations by the Executive Committee, except for the significant gaps in the Cuban defense theory, the others seem reasonable. They elucidate some Soviet motivations but fail to align entirely with the actual circumstances. Where does the problem lie? Allison, the author, believes it lies in the rational actor model. It has loopholes. By simplifying a country into an abstract economic actor, it overlooks the personality traits of top leaders and differences in governmental approaches, factors that significantly influence national behavior. For instance, both Khrushchev and Stalin served as the Soviet Union's top leaders, but their leadership styles were starkly different. Khrushchev sought sensationalism. Even in international politics, he presented an aggressive posture, unlike Stalin. Integrating Khrushchev's character perspective could clarify the inexplicable aspects in the Cold War politics theory and missile strength theory. Yet, the rational actor model neglects these, causing confusion. Kennedy once said, "The nature of final decision-making is not only hard for observers to understand but also for the decision-makers themselves." The Executive Committee's speculations on Soviet motives hovered between the Cold War politics theory, missile strength theory, and Berlin issue theory, brimming with uncertainty. At this point, the singular, rational actor model fell short. Introducing new tools became imperative. Part 2, above is the account from the book Essence of Decision, detailing the Kennedy administration's speculation on the Soviet Union's motives using the rational actor model. In the end, the U.S. largely confirmed that the Soviet missile deployment was linked to the broader, Cold War, objectives, the disparity in nuclear arsenals, and the Berlin issue. However, there were numerous irrationalities in the Soviet actions details. At this point, the Executive Committee began utilizing the second analytical model, known as the organizational behavior model. As mentioned earlier, the hallmark of the rational actor model is the extreme simplification of a country as a subject, perceiving it as an individual with absolute rationality, seeking benefits and avoiding harm. Conversely, the organizational behavior model views a country as a loose collection of independent organizations. In international politics, this includes the Defense Department, diplomatic corps, propaganda, and intelligence agencies. Each organization operates under different regulations and habitual practices, temporarily combining for specific tasks. However, the operational details adhere to each organization's standard processes, resulting in problems. To illustrate, the Soviet missile deployment in Cuba seemed centralized under the Defense Department. Yet, at each phase, different subcontracted organizations were involved. The construction of missile bases was handled by engineering troops. Strategic Missile Forces managed the R-12 and R-14 intermediate-range missiles. Air defense missiles for base protection belonged to the Air Defense Forces. The defense of Cuba's coastline was the responsibility of the Army and Navy. Despite the initial transportation phase, where Soviet intelligence avoided immediate detection by U.S. parties, chaos ensued upon missile deployment. The engineering troops had experience only in constructing bases on home soil, which was inherently secure and didn't require camouflage. Consequently, they erected buildings blatantly in view of U.S. reconnaissance planes. Similarly, the missile forces operated according to old manuals and experiences, making their missile silos conspicuously visible. As for the Army and Navy, they conducted collective drills, standing in formation daily, displaying Soviet flags and emblems around the base. This exposure rendered all deployments ineffective in achieving a surprise attack. Regarding the Air Defense Forces, their purpose was to secure the base. Soviet air defense missiles and radars were promptly deployed around the secret base perimeter. They had the capability to detect U.S. reconnaissance planes and potentially intercept them. However, the Soviet Air Defense Forces had their operational protocols based on homeland experiences. When launching missiles for defense, they required approval from high-ranking commanders. This wasn't an issue in the expansive Soviet territories with numerous missiles, there was always a defense line to thwart invaders. But in the confined space of Cuba, any delay could let U.S. reconnaissance planes fly out of Cuban airspace. Consequently, the Soviet air defense missiles failed to provide cover for the base. You might have noticed by now, these Soviet military branches were acting based on a certain rationality, but it wasn't a singular, national rationality or absolute rationality, it was their own department's organizational rationality. This logic demanded standardized actions, avoiding unconventional measures, and controlling operational costs. While this logic usually worked well, it wasn't suitable for high-risk missions like Cuba. After the Executive Committee analyzed the Soviet anomalies using the organizational behavior model, they reached a significant conclusion: the Soviet troops deployed in Cuba weren't prepared for a large-scale war. Their behavior was highly dogmatic and rigid. In this scenario, the United States could take proactive measures, compelling Khrushchev to withdraw missiles from Cuba. Initially, the U.S. formulated 6 action plans. Allison, the author, believed they were primarily based on the rational actor model but incorporated elements from the organizational behavior model in their deliberation. The first two plans were nearly identical, emphasizing diplomatic pressure without a military response. However, this approach risked making Kennedy appear weak, impacting midterm election results, and potentially leading to presidential impeachment. The third plan involved secret contact with Castro, bypassing Khrushchev, convincing Castro to sever ties with the Soviets. This plan had a low success rate and risked exposing U.S. intentions, thus was discarded. The fourth plan suggested a comprehensive invasion of Cuba, but the risk of direct conflict with Soviet forces made it too costly. Kennedy wouldn't consider it unless absolutely necessary. Therefore, the executive committee had only two viable action paths left. The first was an airstrike, advantageous due to its directness, capable of neutralizing the most threatening Soviet missiles without instigating a full-scale war. However, the U.S. Air Force, as an independent organization, had its organizational rationality. It aimed to achieve the maximum result with minimal losses. To reduce losses, the airstrike had to expand its targets beyond the direct threat of nuclear missiles, targeting peripheral air defense installations. Consequently, this required hundreds of aircraft sorties and multiple strikes to enhance the destruction rate. This led to the plan escalating like a snowball, approaching the scale of a full invasion. After deliberation for 5 days, Kennedy decided to abandon this plan. It was a backlash resulting from the organizational behavior model. Consequently, the executive committee ultimately decided to dispatch the main Navy force to impose a blockade on Cuba. All vessels heading toward Cuba had to undergo inspection by U.S. warships, only those not carrying prohibited items were allowed passage. The downside of this plan was its inability to eliminate the missiles already deployed in Cuba. However, it was more moderate, allowing the Soviets space for a response. Kennedy believed that, from both the rational actor and organizational behavior perspectives, Khrushchev in Cuba lacked a clear strategic intent in war preparedness. Therefore, it was essential to avoid excessively provoking the opponent, providing them room for rethinking and adjustment. The naval blockade could temporarily freeze the situation, awaiting a potential turning point. Indeed, on October 21, the naval blockade operation officially commenced. Simultaneously, the U.S. raised its readiness level to DEFCON 3, preparing for the worst. On the evening of October 26, Khrushchev personally called the U.S. State Department, promising to withdraw the deployed missiles on the condition that the U.S. refrained from invading Cuba. Subsequently, the U.S. also made certain concessions regarding European matters. On October 28, Khrushchev formally announced the withdrawal of nuclear missiles from Cuba. This 13-day crisis ultimately concluded with a reconciliation between both parties. Part 3, All Right, the book Essence of Decision reviewed the impact of the organizational behavior model on the decision-making of the U.S. top echelon. Besides the two models mentioned earlier, author Allison also highlighted a third level called the governmental politics model. This model seemingly doesn't directly affect the decision process but holds significant importance. It doesn't target the abstract state or the various organizations within the government, rather, it pertains to a familiar entity, people. Do you recall that, as mentioned before, the executive committee Kennedy used for decision-making consisted of 12 members in total? The initial 6 response plans of the U.S. were proposals put forward by 6 factions formed by these 12 individuals. Secretary of State Rusk, responsible for diplomacy, sought to lead the decision process and naturally proposed solutions from a diplomatic standpoint. General Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was a staunch hawk and had a good personal relationship with President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy. As soon as he proposed the airstrike plan, Robert Kennedy immediately supported it. However, Defense Secretary McNamara was unenthusiastic about Taylor's proposal. McNamara, a Harvard MBA graduate, disliked the idea of using direct force and went to great lengths to emphasize the risks of an airstrike. For Kennedy, the most challenging test wasn't the Soviet Union but these subordinates. Addressing this phenomenon, Allison pointed out that many people misunderstand government decision-making, assuming that once the president speaks, everyone must unconditionally comply. Some economists even tout the concept of collective rationality, overestimating the degree of compliance among different members. In reality, the decision-making process is an internal game. Members not only negotiate but also engage in trades. Take the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance. It appeared as a diplomatic issue. However, given the upcoming midterm elections and its link to Kennedy's political reputation, solely following Rusk's advice, focusing solely on diplomacy, wouldn't yield any returns in domestic policy for Kennedy. Hence, this deal wasn't feasible. In this scenario, Kennedy himself was a player with vested interests. Allison believes that the so-called governmental politics model involves presenting a solution that most people can accept. In this process, the president essentially becomes a persuader. Note, Allison referred to a solution most people can accept, not the best solution. In practice, operationally speaking, the idea of a naval blockade wasn't foolproof. What if Soviet cargo ships transporting missiles refused inspection? What if a Soviet submarine en route to Cuba fired torpedoes under interception by the U.S. fleet? In reality, during the week-long blockade, several potentially perilous situations arose, and the U.S. didn't have preemptive contingency plans. However, viewed from the governmental politics model, the blockade accommodated the military's desire to display urgency while considering the diplomatic and Defense Department's reluctance to escalate conflict. It was the most comprehensive plan the U.S. could offer, even if imperfect. During the game, Kennedy employed not only analysis and persuasion but also emotional tactics. General Taylor, the most radical airstrike advocate, initially opposed the blockade plan. However, Taylor owed Kennedy a favor. In 1959, due to his poor relationship with Kennedy's predecessor, President Eisenhower, Taylor had temporarily retired from active service. It was the Kennedy brothers' appreciation of Taylor's ability that brought him back into the government, allowing Taylor to assume the position of Joint Chiefs Chairman. When the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, Taylor had just assumed office for 2 weeks. Even if he was confident in his plan, he had to repay the favor to Kennedy and side with the president. You see, the internal politics of the government isn't just about verbal battles or even about whose plan is most efficient. There are intricate personal and political considerations that are quite worth pondering. Alright, I've introduced you to the main content of Allison's Essence of Decision here. The Cuban Missile Crisis can be considered one of humanity's closest moments to destruction during the entire Cold War era. Under the psychological pressure of a nuclear war, facing limited intelligence and conflicting opinions from aides, making the correct decisions and implementing them was undoubtedly an immense challenge. From the perspective of the United States, Kennedy's success in resolving the crisis was crucially linked to his adept use of the rational actor model and the organizational behavior model, while effectively suppressing internal conflicts arising from the governmental politics model. Although Allison, as an American scholar, might slightly overestimate Kennedy and the executive committee's roles, his restoration and analysis of the U.S. decision-making process are generally reliable. The three models distilled in Essence of Decision also provide important intellectual tools for a better understanding of international political phenomena. Furthermore, even though ordinary individuals may not face major events like the Cuban Missile Crisis in daily life and work, the three models summarized by Allison hold significant reference value. The rational actor model can assist in pinpointing decision objectives. The organizational behavior model is crucial in identifying team strengths and behavioral tendencies. As for the governmental politics model, simplified further, it involves persuading team members and forming collective abilities. Few people operate independently throughout their lives, and when collaboration and collective action are necessary, you might find yourself applying the principles from Essence of Decision. That concludes the essence of this book. Congratulations on finishing another book. Thank you all for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with friends around you. Let's combine wisdom with practice, achieve our financial goals, and create a better future together. Thank you all, goodbye.